Well, here we are, Rupert, two friends who've known each other for a little while, and we have a shared interest in the state of the world, the climate, the coming collapse. But we come at it from quite different directions. And we've had conversations about this before. So we thought on this occasion, we'd record just two friends having a conversation with shared interests and just see where it takes us to share with other persons who may be interested in what we have to say.
Yeah. And we've been on the fells this morning, which was great, talking about what we would talk about. And we thought we might start with the sheer direness of the situation right now, the kind of ways in which it's deteriorated even just over the last year. So the complete off the chartness of the ocean and atmospheric temperatures, the extreme floods that ripped the whole world pretty much in the autumn. Then you've got the rapid expansion of AI, which, well, I'll speak for myself and say I regard as profoundly unintelligent and definitely not in the wisdom game. And in Ian McGilchrist's terms, a kind of prosthetic for the left hemisphere of our brains without any kind of modulation from the right. And then, of course, most lately, we've got the accession to power of President Trump and the even more terrible than most of us had expected actions that he's taken in his early time in office. You put all this together, I'm someone who, unlike yourself and our mutual friend and colleague Jem Bendell, has been trying to argue for the past several years, look, we can't rule out the possibility that there may be some way of preempting an uncontrolled set of collapse events in our civilization. But I'm the first to confess at this point that it is getting very hard to see how there is room for reasonable doubt about the trajectory that we're on. Any alien watching what's happening would say this lot are taking a tried and tested path to destruction. So yeah, I guess we both felt that was the inevitable starting point for our conversation, the extreme awfulness of this moment, and perhaps something about the way that strikes us emotionally, and indeed when we try to look at this from the spiritual perspective.
I'm just checking on that walk on the fells. So two particular dimensions I pick up on here. One is the emotional impact of what's going on at both a personal and a collective level, but also the question, having been involved overtly in the spiritual life, both for myself and as a teacher for others, what the hell is the point of it when the world's going to hell in a handcart? Spirit is an approach to the spiritual life really just an excuse to stay high in the clouds and have a blissful experience, and therefore deny facing up to what's going on in material reality. So if we have some questions, there's that around the spiritual life, but just striking me from this morning was looking down on that valley from the fell side. I was overwhelmed by the sorrow of it. The sorrow of this beautiful world and what we've done to it and are continuing to do to it, which then takes me into, do I simply sink into the sorrow? But no, it doesn't. It actually motivates me more to say, well, where's the bit I can do? Is there a bit that can be preserved? Is there some contribution you can make? And if so, what is the spiritual life to that? The second dimension for me, as we were touching on, is I am by definition, or my body is an old man. And so I'm experiencing sorrow at the level, also realizing that I don't statistically have that many years left. And so there is that personal sorrow with the aging process of realizing there will come a time when life comes to an end. And there's a little bit of me also when I looked out on those beautiful fields thinking, oh, I know it sounds like it's like an oxymoron, how can I miss it when I won't be here to miss it? But you're kind of missing it in advance. So I think there's something with what we might call the unfolding collapse
Yeah.
as the profound personal dimension that affects each one of us personally, in the sense of, and it raises the most profound feelings for us,
Yeah.
of sorrow, of guilt and shame, and there is so much goes on in the world
Yeah.
where people are actually avoiding those feelings. Arguably, that's one reason why so many of us do what we do.
Yeah.
Because it's just too painful to face up to.
Yeah. Yeah. We were talking, weren't we, about preemptive mourning and preemptive grieving, because partly one is grieving for what's already happening, but tied in with that is a sense of the very difficult future facing ourselves, and more so the successive generations and so forth. I'm in the very fortunate position of coming to see you now kind of more or less regularly twice a year, when I come up to Grasmere to do this spiritual teaching twice a year. And I've noticed a significant change in the condition of my students just this year from last year. A lot more willingness this year to enter into the space of mourning and grieving, both for now and what I said a moment ago, preemptively. And I guess that also encourages me. I guess what encourages me is that there are more people who are getting willing to do this work, which is not easy work. And that as awareness of the crisis becomes more intense and more personally felt, this kind of psycho-spiritual work will grow and becomes in some ways more important. I always remember some great words of my teacher, Joanna Macy, when she was asked in an interview, I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago now, look, Joanna, you're very old now. Why do you continue making this effort and doing this work? And she responded very succinctly, I do it so that when the time comes, you won't turn on each other. Which I thought is a very deeply beautiful thing to say. But coming back to what you were saying about the feelings you were having looking down on the valley when we were up on the fell, I felt exactly the same way. I call this the great sorrow. The great sorrow is that the great unraveling is outpacing what Joanna calls the great turning. And it's impossible, it's inhuman not to feel that sorrow some of the time. And yeah, it's a great gift and a great burden to be in that kind of place.
That leads me into the question of, what's the point of the spiritual life in relation to that? And there's two things I'd like to say. Even the whole notion of the great dying that's going on, paradoxically, is also an opportunity for a great living. For us to appreciate simply being alive, appreciating the world. And it's not just appreciating the path of spirituality that I've been following these many decades. Certainly one of my great teachers was Ram Dass, who I think would have much in common with Joanna Macy, was recognizing the value of the spiritual life enabled you to feel the pain and still act. So the fruit of the spirit, if you like, of deep spiritual inquiry is not about avoiding the suffering of the world. In fact, arguably, if you are serious about the spiritual life, you feel the pain of the world and your own pain even more. But you also feel the joy. You feel the possibility. You feel a deeper sense of appreciation. And arguably, more importantly, that takes you then in, well, what do I do with it? This is not a spirituality that says, I'm embracing this because it enables me to feel good in a horrible world. I'm embracing this because it enables me to feel in this world and to choose how I will use those feelings to act in the world in some way, where along the contemplative mystical way, there's no great small, there simply is. One, the spiritual life is a compassion that is action orientated. And it's an action orientation that's rooted in full awareness. You've dealt with your stuff. For example, you want to fix the world, you want to have power, you want to be loved, whatever your reasons might be, you approach them differently. And arguably the fruit of the spirit there is one of equanimity.
Mm.
You're able to see all your stuff going on and you find your pressure point, your little bit. We can be overwhelmed by the enormity of the suffering that's unfolding before us at every level,
Yeah.
as well as our own personal suffering that
Mm.
arises.
Mm.
But then the question, well, so what?
Mm.
And if you take the Taoist principle of I do nothing and nothing left is undone,
Mm.
you find your action in the world as a quality of service from deep sense of soul, of spirit, that enables you to function without being overwhelmed by all that's going on. You don't even feel the need to do it. I don't feel the need to fix the world. There's a dreamlike ego quality, but love to sort it all out. And I know that I can't.
Yeah.
One of the great spiritual qualities is humility, is recognizing the limitations. But then it comes down to, well, where's my bit? In the Kentigern School for contemplatives that we have, one of the last great qualities we explore is service. And in that service, we talk about your pressure point. Where's your little bit?
Yes.
It might simply be that as a result of this spiritual work and this enhanced awareness, you're just a nicer person in your family, or you're working more locally with your community, or you do indeed go out and involve in some great project. But in the spiritual life, there's no greater, lesser. The exercise of compassion is compassion as it is, whether it's necessarily using judgmental terms like there's great action or small action. Every little bit counts in a sense.
Yeah. I think the bit about this isn't a problem to be fixed is really important, right? There is loads of work to do in relation to the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, etc. But the totality of that work, well, A, it's not all going to get done, and B, even if somehow it was, it wouldn't be the fixing of a problem. It's rather more like we're trying to learn how to inhabit a new and difficult condition. We're facing a predicament, a multidimensional predicament, a helpful word that my friend Dugald Hein uses about what we're facing here. And yeah, we need to find our own place in that. I think you and I are both very much agreed that any spirituality worth its salt is going to have an engaged dimension. That was certainly something that Thich Nhat Hanh, as well as Joanna Macy, taught me. I think it's just absolutely crucial. But as you say, there has to be suffusing the whole thing, a humility. And what I emphasize very strongly to my students is a profound spirit of acceptance. And with acceptance comes gratitude. And as you hinted, I think, Steve, the gratitude can be all the greater precisely because of our openness to the suffering of the world, our own suffering, etc. So, for example, one of the things I encourage my students to notice is that because they are probably more attuned than the average person to the fragility of, say, ecosystems that they are looking at, and maybe they're feeling kind of pain at the thought that this ecosystem is vulnerable, maybe it's going to be wiped out by the coming terrible wildfires or by more extractive agriculture, etc. And maybe they're tempted therefore to think something like, it's a shame that I have to feel this pain, whereas ordinary folk, as it were, can just sort of enjoy the view or something. But I encourage them to notice, actually, when you are appreciating the vulnerability of, say, this landscape, you can have a more intense appreciation of it, because an ordinary person, as it were, who is just taking it for granted, is taking it for granted. Whereas you're feeling, oh, perhaps I need to appreciate this more than ever before, because it may not be here forever. It's the classic stuff about imagine if this sunset you were going to see this evening is your last. And of course, for any of us on any given day, it might be, right? If you knew it was going to be your last, you would absolutely savor it, etc. Right? It's that taking that kind of spirit into, well, as much as possible. So it seems to me that there is scope for, if you will, an acceleration and a deepening of gratitude as we open to the pain, as we open to the suffering. And that sounds paradoxical, but actually it makes a profound sense. And that is one of the ways in which the spirit of what Tara Brach calls radical acceptance, while on the one hand, there's a sense in which it's really hard, on the other hand, there's this beautiful sense that you were alluding to in which it opens you to stuff which otherwise you're going to find it very hard to be open to. And that has its own benefits and privileges that come along with it, which is a nice coincidence.
Deep adaptation to what's going on.
Yeah.
Presumes there's superficial adaptation, if any.
Yeah.
And, we see around the world superficial adaptation, such as what is going on with the political scene in the States and other countries, which is an effort to use existing models of changing things, changing the world, using very superficial models. They are the basic political systems have run out of steam.
Yeah.
And arguably all those systems, all the systems, which includes our religious, political and social structures, if they've all led us to this point, are they going to be useful for solving the problem in the future? Because they brought us here. So the question is, what new forms are going to be needed? And I think if there's to be deep adaptation, there has to be deep spirituality. And that means both a renewal of something that our ancients knew, which is a profound kinship with all of life. And with what science has revealed to us about the nature of life, offers us the potential to see life entirely differently. But life isn't something that only happens in things like you and I breathing and moving around and reproducing, and the whales in the sea and the birds in the air. But actually the whole damn thing is alive. Everything is consciousness knowing itself. And that potentially brings a different quality of relationship to ordinary reality, when we recognize that this life is in all things. It's present in all things. And that raises the possibility of a deeper appreciation of kinship with all of life. That the very essence of life that binds is in all these atomic structures that don't appear to have a conscious life form. At some level, there is a deep sense of connection with that same energy, that same life force that is working in all things, even things that appear to be inanimate. And that might enable us to have a greater reverence for all of life. But it might enable us to appreciate and have gratitude for life and for being part of that life more, and how we therefore choose to work in the world, how we eat, how we build houses, and so on and so forth, how we relate to other forms of life. And that has the potential to take us into a much deeper place of connection to all of life. And that's not going to be done, I think, without a lot of work. But I noticed that at the moment, 10 years ago, if you were trying to have explorations of connections between spirituality and the world crisis, the work was there, but it was relatively thin and few and far between. Now, world communications are awash with opportunities for spiritual exploration, for connecting ecology and spirituality. So there's a huge burgeoning movement there that is offering an opportunity for us, even in the midst of catastrophe, to live fully within it. So that in that sense, we move out of worship, prayer, spiritual practices happen at a certain point in time in a certain building with a certain group. Your whole damn life becomes an act of worship. Your whole life is a prayer. Gratitude, appreciation, service are spiritual practices. They are connecting to all that is. So it's a way of spiritual exploration of the depths that is both expansive, but it's also it's very localized, it's very minute, it's very personal.
So much I want to say in response to that. Marvelous. So I want to start with a little anecdote. I paid a visit last year to a project called Retrofit Balsall Heath. So this is in Birmingham. It's in a quite deprived, multi-ethnic part of Birmingham, and they're doing this amazing work of retrofitting houses there. And retrofit, of course, is one of the ultimate kind of no-brainers of the climate crisis. It means that you tackle the cost of living crisis. It means your houses are warmer and more comfortable. You're not heating the sky. You're reducing dependence on foreign dictators. You're more adapted. You are, of course, reducing climate emissions. You know, it's crazy that there isn't more retrofit happening, and these guys are trying to show the way on it. Now, their project is linked with the local mosque, which is an eco mosque, and I went to hear Friday prayers there. And I must tell you, I'm getting chills now thinking about it. It was a profound experience, because really is an eco mosque, and you're going to be amazed when I tell you this. At the peroration of the remarks that the Imam made that afternoon was the following sentence. This is a direct quote. He said, "And so you see, my friends, climate action is actually a form of worship."
Absolutely.
You know, and I just thought that gives such hope that that's happening. So we've got stuff happening in monotheism. You know, we've got stuff happening in Islam, in Christianity. I mean, the most striking example of Christianity, of course, is the Pope's Laudato Si. Anyone who hasn't read it, you know, absolutely incredible work of ecological consciousness. But I do think there is a bit of a but. It isn't clear that the monotheisms are going to find it at all easy to make this transition. And that's one reason why I think it's really important for us to be open to more explicitly eco-spiritual approaches, pagan type approaches, all the various forms of what's sometimes called dark green religion or dark green spirituality. And one of the things that really gives me hope is that not only is it the case that in the monotheisms some progress is being made, but it is most definitely the case that there is an uprising of psycho-spiritual, eco-spiritual consciousness. A lot of it kind of still below the radar, but it's burgeoning. And I think it is absolutely certain that this tendency is going to grow as the crisis deepens, because people are going to be looking for meaning, right? What people do when real crisis hits is they resort to some of the traditional ways of making meaning in relation to very, very difficult times. And there's none more potentially powerful than what we call religion and spirituality. And it is crucial that those eco-spiritualities are available and supported and so forth, so that people don't end up taking less salubrious paths with this need for meaning. Now, if we take that to what you've said about adaptation, the different kinds of adaptation, it is clear that the inner dimension of adaptation, which has been foregrounded in deep adaptation and is also very important in transformative adaptation, and then the work such as it is that I do, it is clear that that is really important and is recognized increasingly as being important, whereas the traditional forms of climate adaptation, things like building higher flood defenses, etc., right, don't have that dimension typically. And that's one of the reasons why they are weak and reactive and superficial. We need the deeper, more transformative forms of adaptation, which have this inner dimension built in. But now we come to possibly a slight difference between this, which might be interesting to explore a little. What I heard you offering when you were describing how you see this in relation to how people take the world and how we might take the world in a more appropriate way to our time was something like an animist consciousness, whereas my approach tends more towards the pantheist or panentheist. And for me, what is sacred is fundamentally life. And by life, I mean life in the ordinary sense. And what sometimes troubles me about animism is that it can lose the importance of the distinction, which I think is a really important distinction between the living and the non-living. And it can lose the sense of the absolute specialness of life, which for me is what, if you will, animates eco-spirituality, ecological consciousness, ecological politics, etc., all of these things. So I wonder how you respond to that. My sense is that there's a fascinating kind of debate and different kind of sensibilities to be explored here. But I want to say that at the heart of the sacred in relation to what we need to hold on to and what we need to tune into more in the future is life, not necessarily in the kind of expanded sense you mentioned, but simply life in its ubiquity and splendor and beauty.
I agree that life consciousness exists at many planes of reality. That would be the first element of the spiritual life that I and many others embrace. In old language, it's the contemplative, it's the mystical.
Yeah.
Where you reckon there are different levels, different planes of it. So, for example, I wouldn't necessarily see that the consciousness that we have, or those crows that we saw soaring through the air today, have the same life as what this chair does. But their essential essence, the thing in which they are held, out of which they have emerged, causes me to have a different appreciation, an acceptance of the wonder of it all, the fact that this chair is a chair, and that you are here, and there are bigger. It's so I wouldn't say that it's all the same in the sense of a sort of judgmental turn of teasing things out in different bits. But what I think that does is, and that appreciation of the many planes of consciousness is a root element of many traditions. You know, it's in the Sufis in Islam, it's in the Buddhist Zen mystics, it's in the Christian mystics, the path I've been following. That same thing is there. All of them have this element of something that takes us into that there is something more, what Evelyn Underhill called the something other, the real in which the reality takes place. Now, I recognize that's not for everybody. I recognize that human beings, with all our many different qualities of intelligence, of intellect, of experience, of all those kind of things, we will approach ultimate reality in different ways. For some people, it's a non-starter. For some people, it's a profound and deep experience. This enormous continuum of human possibility, which is part of the wonder of it. You know, it's all part of this vast creative process, this huge symphony that the universe is, on which we all have a note to play in it. So, but then what seems to have happened is historically a familiar pattern that a wonderful understanding of unity consciousness arises, and then it gets enveloped in a religion that tends to crystallize it and harden it into rituals and theoretical knowledge and practices that don't connect to the way the whole of the life, in the real life, the whole of life is unfolding. So that leads me into the question. I really appreciate what you're saying about the work that's going on at that mosque, but it still leaves me with the question: if the existing religions have been part of the social structure and everything else that have brought it to this part, not them entirely, but part of it, are they part of the solution? Or is there something in them? Now, you could argue that if you look at this, where we are in Cumbria, the Lake District, there's a big Anglican diocese. It's wealthy. It's got lots and lots of workers in it. It's got really effective channels of communication, so on and so forth, as have the other religions. Now, is there something, therefore, which is something I believe is a possibility, arguably clinging to, that those religions, if they open themselves more to recognizing the power that they can bring, for example, in pastoral care, in helping people to deal with the grief and the sorrow when it hits, and the shame and the anger and all the other things. At the moment, a lot of the religions have tended to see adaptation, if they see it at all, as, well, if we can make our church or our mosque eco-friendly, we're putting LED bulbs, then we're doing a good job. Yes, to a degree. And then what I'm with, then some, if we accept that what's going on in the crisis, underneath it all is fear. Vast numbers of human beings, whether they are in denial or they're experiencing anxiety at many levels. That anxiety has a profound impact. It affects the way we relate to ourselves and to others. It affects our health. Anxiety suppresses your immune system. And we know that spiritual life is a great countermanding to anxiety. That where there is faith in the broadest sense, in that there is more to life than there is to me, that there is an ultimate reality, a god, a goddess, however you experience it, it enables you to live in the world with more equanimity. Now, I'm left with the question of, well, what forms is there a new forms? Are there new forms emerging? I would suggest that they are, not least, for example, by returning to that quality relationship that the ancestors have, but equally you find, we were talking about Martin Buber and his I, thou, I, it,
Yeah.
the shifting of our relationships to
Yeah.
life is that the spiritual life facilitates, but also is there things there, like, for example, at a simple level, if we get past the denial, that if deep adaptation suggests wake up churches, mosques, temples, realize you have enormous potential in helping people to deal with the profound feelings that we are going through and continue to go through when we feel all those very powerful human feelings, anger, despair, fear, that's all in there underneath the surface. And if that is so, then, for example, I might say to the church I belong to, what's your point? What's the point you being here? If you cannot help what is going to be millions of people now facing profound anxiety, what's the point of you? And if you don't have a point, get out the way. If you do have a point, then let's develop it. And I think there is hope there in those churches, both in their action for climate change, the kind of things they do to reduce carbon production, etc., but also how do they use their skills, their histories, their stories in pastoral care to help people deal with the enormous pain that all of us are going to be facing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I agree with that so much. So let's start with the role of the churches. Like you, I think on the one hand, when we look at the potentialities in Islam, in Judaism, in Christianity, they are significant because you've got a lot of people there whose USP, whose role in life is to offer some kind of sense of meaning in relation to crisis, and that's happened again and again in history. And that has to be, that potentiality has to be exploited, if you will, to the maximum. If I'm talking with people in Islam or Christianity, one of the main things I say to them is, look, it's all very well making your churches a bit more eco-friendly, but the most important thing you can potentially do is actually use your bully pulpit, is speak to the reason why people look to you in the first place, which is for some kind of guidance, and actually get serious about that. And that is, to his credit, what Pope Francis has sought to do. So I think that the monotheisms need to step much more seriously into that space. I think that they can, but like you, I am skeptical that they are ever going to get into that space deeply enough and seriously enough to do all the spiritual and religious work, if you will, in this area that needs to be done. And that's again why I think it's so important that people are pursuing, often outside any formal institution, forms of deep ecological consciousness, various kinds of old and new spiritual practices in relation to the earth, in relation to other animals. You mentioned Buber and the I thou. One of the transitions I think we are starting to go through, which I think is going to be so powerful, is really starting to take non-human animals seriously as thous. You know, with whether it's crows or cetaceans or elephants or our domesticated animals or the animals that we eat. There are big jobs to be undertaken here in terms of facing up to the extent to which we need to be willing to return the gaze of these creatures and take them seriously as fellow consciousnesses who are with us, making and remaking and enjoying and enduring and so on and so forth, this beautiful world. So I think that it's a question of trying to help, if you will, the monotheisms to do as good a job as they can, not trusting that we can just leave it to them, but continuing to pursue things ourselves. I'm a member of the religious society of friends, the Quakers, and there's this notion in Quakerism. You've got to look for that of God in everyone. So in terms of what I just said, one of the implications of that would be, well, can we look for that of God in our dogs and cats and chickens and rooks and crows and so on and so forth? And if we manage to do that, we'll imagine a lot of people getting to the point of doing that. And I think that is starting to happen. That is going to be quite transformative in relation to how we treat the earth as a whole. Yeah.
I think there's we could have a field day on God, what God is. And from the tradition that I follow, it's even problematic to use words like God, because the thing that is fundamentally unnameable, the moment you start conceptualizing and applying human qualities to it, whatever it is, and yet it is very real. I live and move and have my being in something that lives and moves and has being in me. There is something wholly other than myself, yet it is also myself. And one of the great gifts, for example, of that Quaker tradition of seeing that of God in everyone is, well, if there's God in you and there's God in me, that's where our common ground is, regardless of our personal differences. If I'm a soul and you're a soul, well, hey, look at you. What are you doing being Rupert? Look at here's me being Stephen. It brings a different quality to our lives.
It also emphasizes the internal relation between us, how we're not separated from each other, how we partake of something which is more deeply interfused.
And then can we stretch that out when we look at a whale ploughing its way through the oceans, or those birds soaring in the sky? At some level, there is that of God, the light within, the creative force, the divine is in you too. And if the religions, which have often got crystallized and locked down into almost entirely humanistic perceptions of reality, and yet, that lovely example you gave with the mosque, I would say the same to some of the churches, that when you recognize that prayer, for example, which is your way of relating to ultimate reality, to the word I use is the beloved, because there's a feeling quality to it. This great thing is not some neutral force at work. There is something there out of that creative order that is, the word I'm left with is love, which sounds hopefully banal to use it, hopelessly banal to use.
It's a splendid word.
Yeah, I do. And yet it's there. It's both emanating and it's present and it's utterly beyond me, but it's there. So therefore, if I'm resting in that place, in the utterly something other, which is not in time but is in eternity, which is not the same thing, then it can bring a very different quality to the way we participate in the world, which we bring down to a simple level is being kind to the neighbor is an act of worship. It's a prayer. Prayer isn't something that you go to your mosque or temple or church and do at a certain time. That's one form of prayer. An expanded understanding of prayer is the way I look after my garden, the way I treat my neighbor, the way I choose or not to travel by bus or car, all those kind of things come into it, because they're underpinned, they're anchored by a reverence and respect for all of life.
Yes. This is one of the reasons why I really appreciate the Quaker way, because of the sense in which Quakers have historically emphasized that you can't just sequester off worship to like an hour once a week. That also explicitly, for example, when Quakers do their business together, try to get their business done, organize their affairs, etc., they seek to do that in the spirit of the worship, and it goes out into your whole life, right? It's supposed to, it should be, right, about living a life that is simple and ethical and peaceful, etc. This takes us in an interesting way back to the question of ritual that you mentioned, because again, I appreciate Quakerism because it has tended to not get stuck in the narrow ritualism of quite a lot of Christianity. But then it's so interesting, isn't it, that you can also have ritual that enables spaces of freedom and deep contemplation and engagement with the difficult emotions that you were mentioning earlier, which would be very difficult without those rituals. So I'm thinking, for example, of some of Joanna Macy's work that reconnects. So in my spiritual teaching, I teach a sort of modified version of her mirror walk exercise and her truth mandala exercise. And the truth mandala in particular is designed as a kind of new ritual with all sorts of kind of rules and specificities. And the point of the rules and specificities is to open up this amazing safe space in which people can engage with these really difficult emotions, can engage with their ecological despair and their rage at what's being done to the world and their profound fear for their grandchildren, etc. And what we find when we allow and safely hold these kinds of psycho-spiritual processes, when we allow these emotions to observe, to emerge and to presence, what we find is that we don't get stuck in them and that they're not as overwhelming as we feared that they were. And indeed, what we start to find is that they can provide us with an extraordinary energy, which can power us into fresh action and fresh determination and so forth. And this is why, again, I find in the great darkness of this time, these kinds of opportunities that are rising up in response to it, enormously, well, hopeful, enormously energizing. That when you do the truth mandala, for example, with a bunch of people who have found a little bit of safety and interrelationship with each other, it takes people into and through places that they never thought they'd be able to touch, things that they were too scared of. And in particular, I think it's really striking the way that it enables people to go into and then to work through and in a certain sense emerge from despair and grief and shame, the emotions which don't get as much of an airing in our society as perhaps fear and anger do, and actually I think have the deepest potentiality for the transformations that we profoundly need.
I think one of the things is you used the word ritual.
Yeah.
Of how because our powerful emotions are so difficult to deal with, that we try to narrow it down to enable us to deal with that fear. So we can even ritualize compassion. We can ritualize service so that it becomes limited, but it's kind of safe. We feel we've done something. So, pretty much every religious organization all around us will probably do something like have a food bank. Wonderful. Yes, you'll probably do something like changing the lighting so that it's more efficient.
Yeah.
Great. What are you doing about food injustice, if you're giving them? What are you doing about why the hell we're using these kind of power sources in the first place?
Yeah.
And where's the stuff coming from?
Yeah.
So it takes you into more and more difficult questions, which can be quite difficult to handle unless you've got something at the center of yourself. Even Quakers use the expression centering down in some form, where you feel a deep sense of presence in something that is both part of you and yet transcends you. And I know that many of my atheist friends would say, well, that's a load of nonsense. There's no such thing, etc., etc. Great. We all have our different approaches to what life is. The question then is, where's the beef? Whatever approach to life you've got, how are you contributing? How are you both taking care of yourself? That wonderful phrase of Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. So that it's both a question of we can be loving ourselves and taking care of ourselves while at the same time being of service in the world. And so that takes me on into the next question, actually, which is when you talked about feeling that of God within everyone, pretty much all spiritual paths take you down as well. How do you find that? How do you identify? How do you know it? Even if presume you know it's there. I think the evidence is most people know at some point in their lives, there's more to me than who I think I am, much more to me than who I think I am. So, for example, in our contemplative school, the first thing we look at is, who are you? And most people are trapped, not to say addicted to, aspects of identity. This is who I am. I'm a father, I'm a nurse, I'm a doctor, I'm a post person, I'm a poet, whatever. I am, or I am angry, or I'm sad, or I am grieving. But that is only one level of perception. If you peel back the layers behind that, and for example, you start to things like, it's not that I'm Stephen, I am experiencing being Stephen. I am experiencing being a man.
And you make it more
I'm
verbal.
Experiencing being angry. I'm experiencing being sad. It does enable us to see, actually, there's a bit of me that isn't trapped by all these things. It actually is profoundly liberating. And of course, we get back to the I amness.
Yes.
the very essence of what it is to be me, the very heart of me, the soul, the light within, whatever you call it. But it's from that place that our other planes of consciousness react differently in the world, so that, you know, you will have a very different experience of life from saying, you know, what's happened to me once when someone described me as a cancer patient. And I said, no, I'm not. My body has cancer. I'm experiencing having cancer, but I am not a cancer patient. You see the trap there of identities, which is both deeply Christian and deeply Buddhist. It transcends religions, not getting caught up in identities, and equally caught up in the experience of, you know, I'm angry, I'm sad. There's a difference. I am experiencing anger.
Yes.
Where's that coming from?
Yeah.
It means that a part of me that is not angry. There's a part of me that is not Stephen.
Yes. Yeah.
And in all traditions, that part of us flows beyond ordinary reality. It's the realm that's of the immortal, of the eternal, which is much more. And with that, then comes the possibility that whatever is happening in this reality, whatever happens to the world, life in some form goes on. The universe will continue to be self-creating.
Which might take us to Mother Julian, but perhaps from my neck of the woods down in East Anglia, perhaps not quite. So absolutely wonderful. Let me go back to the stuff about adaptation, and then I'll come to what you've just said about identity. I guess another of the things I would say to the monotheistic churches is it's great that you're making an effort to make yourselves more climate friendly, eco-friendly. You need to step that effort up. But actually, the profound challenge of our time now, because, you know, going back to the very start of our conversation, how bad things have got, is frankly more one now of adaptation than, say, decarbonization. And adaptation means, how are you helping people to respond in a way, in a spiritual way, in a social, psychological way, to the immense challenges that are here and the much bigger challenges that are coming? And it also means, how are you starting to prepare for example, the coming climate disasters? You know, churches ought to be thinking not just, how do we make our electricity consumption go down, and not even how do we get better at doing a food bank, but how do we start to prepare for a possible situation in which really a high percentage of our parishioners might become swept away or indigent or whatever it might be, because of what is likely coming down the track at us. It's that kind of step into real transformative adaptation, or deep adaptation, or strategic adaptation consciousness that people are still tending to resist. And of course, the reason they're resisting it is because it's challenging. And when you start doing that kind of preparedness, you are admitting that we are way out of the safe zone, and that this is not a problem that we're going to get fixed. Now, taking that to the question of identity, I think that we could say that people's identity as members of a more or less kind of stable society in an inevitable capitalist system, in the Holocene, etc., that identity itself is starting to be challenged, right? And that's an inevitability, but again, it's not very comfortable. But again, that's the work. That's what we have to help people with. And I mean, we might compare this to the way in which various forms of identity politics on the right and the left have been very influential in recent years. And most of those forms, frankly, are obsessed with some kind of idea of a kind of fixed identity at the core. This is who I really am as a person, whether it's being from a certain ethnicity or having a certain kind of sexual identity or something. This is who I really am as a person, and I'm going to hold on to that come what may, and I'm going to fight for that. And it seems to me that this is where a spiritual perspective, and it connects also potentially with some philosophical perspectives, such as the existentialist perspective. This is where a spiritual perspective can be, I think, really helpful in being challenging. And as you said, inviting people to think, well, maybe there's something deeper. And at that deeper level, maybe it's going to be possible for us, at least in principle, to transcend some of these ways in which we are allowing ourselves to be divided and turned against each other in ways that right now in the United States, Trump is weaponizing, and there's a threat that weaponization is gonna keep on spreading unless we are willing to look for what we have that is more in common. And part of that is the deeper level of who we really are in a spiritual sense. And so for me, this is a profound aspect of what it is to engage in practices of radical acceptance, of deep acceptance. I've been trying to work on this with some of my students recently using the Dzogchen Tibetan Buddhist teachings, which are very much based in this sense of who am I, keeping on going back to where one's attention is welling up, the rigpa, the clearness that underlies any possible meditation, and finding in that something eternally emerging, eternally changing, which is not any one kind of, frankly, more or less superficial human identity, but something much deeper, and something which, if we're willing to find it and willing to go there, all human beings have in common.
I think if we look at what I call about the cause of the causes, where's the root of all this damn shit show? Where's it arisen? Is that somewhere along the line, enormous numbers of human beings have become disconnected from life, from ultimate reality, from a sense of self. It's disconnection. If spirituality is about finding meaning, purpose in life, connection, love, those things are, and that connection might be with us as persons, it might be with all of nature, it might be with ultimate reality, God, whatever we want to call it. But without that, whatever adaptation might happen in the future, if it is not spiritual, then it's not going to work.
It'll be superficial.
There will be
swept away.
The future will be spiritual, or there'll be no future.
Yeah.
Now, what forms that spirituality takes, whether it is rooted in something that is deep and unchangeable and has always been with us, or whether it has to evolve and bring in new dimensions of that. But I think the fundamental thing is, as Thomas talked about, which is only connect. It is about, it's fundamentally about connection with each other and all that is. Now, so many of the political movements, some of which you touched on, are not about connection. There seems to be a connection because we all of us think this. And if we rely on what we think to connect, then at some point we'll disconnect, because you might say your politics is MAGA and my politics is Marxist. Then we can perfectly well sit at dinner together and hang out together. But if we start to argue from what I believe the world to be from that perspective, then what you think of will start to divide, begin to disconnect. Whereas the authentic spiritual life is entirely about connection. It's about recognizing, well, if I'm an I am and you're an I am, my gosh, we're the same. And my God, that whale in its own way is an I am. That bird is an I am. The whole world is an I am. And there's a profound sense of connection that then arises that otherwise might escape us. And without it, we're scared. And we then try to block out or hide or deny that fear by having a new car or a new house, or I mean, you just watch the telly. That's massive of reality programs, and they're anything but real. They're anything but reality. And that includes where AI is taking us. AI doesn't scare me. Real intelligence scares me with an artificial intelligence because of what we do with it. But somewhere beneath all of that, in all this melee of messiness, there is something going on. And I have hope and trust in that. And not least because it happens when you see human beings get together and begin to connect. Then, you know, we can't move mountains. We do amazing stuff. You know, I mentioned earlier, I live in a lovely bucolic existence here in the English Lake District. It's lovely, in a nice village. There's lovely people about the place. But we are essentially, you know, we're all getting on leading our own lives. But it's when we come together, things happen. So, for example, we are having a problem getting broadband in the village. And a few people kind of rose to the challenge, how can we do it? And if the big boys like British Telecom won't play, where do we go? How do we get? So some people began to initiate it, some took leadership, but in the end, the village got together and we developed a program through a program called a local foundation that helps villages to create broadband,
Oh.
and the people got together and they did it themselves.
mm.
Now, I think there's a mirror image there that if there's hope in the future, it has to be a restoration of communitarianism, of
Totally.
acting people
Yes.
together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is something in the Climate Majority Project where I do my main paid work now, which we totally think that the process of adaptation is inherently a process of rebuilding community, of relocalization. This is going to have obvious outer dimensions. It also needs to have a kind of shared inner dimension. And the really encouraging thing is people are hungry for this, right? They want to be able to find ways of joining together, being together, enjoying together, etc. You know, a lot of people, frankly, really don't want anything more than to be able to do things like sit around a fire together, drinking and singing songs and stuff like that. And of course, they know that if they're going to be able to do that, there are sometimes other things that they're going to have to do together in terms of whether it's conflict resolution or whether it's in terms of some kind of common food provision, etc. This is definitely going to be a coming thing. And again, that's something that gives me active hope in the darkness of our time, because people want it. And when they start to get more of it. So in my village, for example, I've lived in a village on the edge of the Norfolk Broads now for 3.5 years, and my wife and I are trying to build a little tiny bit of resilience on our third of an acre land, but we're also trying to encourage some of the seeds which are there in the local community of building a little bit of community resilience as well. So one of the initiatives is being a community orchard. And the thing which was so encouraging when we had the day when we were planting the orchard, the village has about 1,000 people in it altogether. 100 people, 10% of the entire village turned out that day on a cold winter's day to start planting this orchard together. So many people turned out that by the time the last people were coming, there were no trees left for them to plant. And more recently, we've had a wassail ceremony in the community orchard. The first wassail, as far as we know, that's happened in Rockland for a long time. There used to be a lot of orchards in our area, but most of them were grubbed up very sadly. So we're just starting to bring them back. And again, so many more people turned up for this wassail than we thought, and they absolutely loved it. It was a freezing cold day. There were about 50, 60 people there, I think, and people, having a bit of cider, everyone joining in the songs together, blessing the trees, appreciating the trees, doing a little bit of pruning work on one or two of the trees. People want this stuff, and not just necessarily the usual suspects. A lot of people are hungry for this, and that has to be something which we remember if we're ever inclined to think, oh, it's all hopeless, and why do we even bother?
Well, I think one of the things, why do we even bother? We can feel a sense of despair when everybody doesn't want to bother. And in any community, any gathering of people, then you're lucky if you can get about 10% to 30% who will actually be actively engaged. But it doesn't need everybody.
No. And more will come over time as the crisis deepens. More will come.
And I think what we have to also do is find different milieu that enable people to come together in different ways.
We have to lower the barriers to entry. You have to make it easier for people to feel their way in. For example, we've spoken a lot in this conversation about spirituality. I think we need to make clear to people, if people get a bit scared off by that word, which some people do, that just taking a walk in nature, for example, could be a kind of nature spirituality, a kind of communing with what is, that doesn't demand whatever, a particular ritual or any special long words or whatever.
I'm thinking of things like, we just had a wonderful nature spirituality time. How could you not feel a sense of wonder, beauty, love, appreciation, joy, awe at this, and then the possibility of, wow, where's this come from? What does it exist in? Where is it going? And I'm part of it. There is and for me, it's an absolute sense of presence. There is something other than myself, but it's also myself, and we're all part of it. But we can all experience that sense of connection and wonder, not necessarily just by attending, for example, a church service.
So
if, like in our village, We organise a folk night at the pub. Some other groups do a lot of active volunteering using the Quaker Friends to open up a cafe in the summer. Other people organise art groups in the village hall, things like that. And each of them in their own way, for different people, brings different people together in a different milieu, but it provides a sort of connection. You meet your neighbour. How can you love your neighbour if you don't know who the hell they are?
Yeah.
And now clearly it's different if you're in an inner city area where people are living on top of each other. It's going to have very different challenges than out here in a rural community, which is relatively well off compared to, say, many inner city areas. But although the challenges are different, they're not insurmountable. And if you look at the response, for example, of the people who lived in Grenfell Tower, who went through an awful tragedy, many of them turned that suffering into a real source of community action and commitment and so forth.
And that's another example, isn't it, of how the onset of tragedy can and must be used to bring out what is in some sense its opposite. So this is a absolutely central theme of my own work for some years now, that we are facing into a time where there is a huge and growing onset of suffering. Disasters, climate disasters are coming. There's going to be more and more of them. That these difficult emotions that we've discussed are rising more and more because there is cause for them to arise, right? If you're not sometimes eco-anxious, if you're not sometimes scared, then you're not paying attention. What has to be crucial is to find in and through these very dangers and tragedies and disasters what we need. I take a lot of inspiration from a line from the great German poet Hölderlin, who said, "Where the danger is, there, precisely there, lies also the saving power."
Absolutely.
And that's how it can be. I think that you and I are seeking, along with many others, of course, to try to face into this tragedy, to try to face up to climate reality, to try to not shy away from the enormous wave of suffering that is coming, even greater than anything we currently have, and to find that in various ways that we've been talking about in this conversation, it has saving powers. It has these true and beautiful silver linings. And I think that coming into contact with and living that truth is something which is truly transformational.
I've spent a lot of my life, still do, life working with people who are dying or who are suffering immensely. They're facing cancer, death, prison, whatever it might be, but spiritual crisis of one form or another. And one of the ways through it, transform through it, is to take it, and this sounds completely counterintuitive, but you find your way to say yes to it.
Acceptance.
And I've lost count the number of people who said to me on the quiet, almost as it were, I could tell you this, Stephen, but I couldn't tell my family. I'm almost glad I've had cancer, or was abused, or was fit, because I use that. So in all suffering, there's always a grace. Always it's there. It's the spiritual life enables us to find that. And it takes us away from denying the suffering or going off into hedonistic, whatever it might be, to avoid the suffering. So it sounds counterintuitive to say yes to suffering, not to say, yes, thanks very much, this is really horrible, I want more of it. Rather, this is really horrible. Is there something in here I need to see? Is this teaching me something?
Where is the gift?
If you take that from the personal into the wider sphere, then what is going on with the collapse and the crisis? Our challenge is not to say, no, I don't want to hear about it. I want to go and get drunk and have another party, build some obsequious political party that will make us all feel good. No, is there something in this that I need to learn? Is this teaching me something? And I believe it is. I think this terrible crisis we're going through, which on balance is going to get worse before it gets better, before it stabilizes. Then what is in it that it is teaching us? And I think the most important thing it's teaching us is only connect. That's the most important thing it's teaching us. And that only connection comes through if there's deep inquiry, there has to be deep spirituality.
Mm-mm.
I'm not sure, and it's not going to be the forms that we've had in the past,
Mm-mm.
which may scare some of people belonging attached to religious groupings.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's again about what you're talking about is again about a profound spirit of acceptance. So we need to accept that this civilization is coming to an end. We need to accept our own entanglement with that and some elements of complicity. We need to accept that in some ways this civilization coming to an end is a good thing because of some of the aspects of it which are abominable. For example, the utterly abominable way in which we treat virtually all animals in our farming, industrialized farming systems. And we need to accept also the very real upsides and potential beauties and gifts. You need to keep on, and what acceptance is, right, as you're saying, is to keep on looking for the gift in any microcosm or in any macrocosm, however harsh or terrible it is. And none of this means, therefore, it's okay for people to do bad things or whatever. What it means is we accept what is. We'll always find what there is in it, which is a gift, which is a learning, which points to what could come out of this, which would not necessarily make it all okay, but redeem it as much as it can be redeemed. We need to find the saving power, which is always lurking within the danger. But again, I mean, none of this means that the awfulness is not there. I want to say something. I want to go back to what we said earlier about the tremendous sadness. I knew exactly what you meant when you were talking about looking down on this wonderful, damaged but still wonderful landscape and feeling how tragic it is that floods are likely to sweep through it and wildfires may sweep through it and desperate people searching for anything to eat, whatever, may sweep through it. The sadness is when one starts to look into this is so great that sometimes it leads one to situations where one totally doesn't want to be in them. So I'm going to give an example for something that's been happening to me recently. Sometimes if I contemplate what things may be like in, say, 30 years' time, when I'm even older than you, even older than you are now, I mean, because of course I'll never be older than you. If I contemplate that, if I think, for example, okay, so by the time I'm 90, 32 years from now, if that happens, that would be 2057. I find myself thinking things like, okay, so what are the North Atlantic currents likely to be that by that time? Will the Gulf Stream have collapsed? And then I find myself having a really uncomfortable thought, which is, maybe I'm going to get to be in the place of safety of the grave before the Gulf Stream collapses, and that will be a relief. And that is just such an awful thought to have, is, if I then make a connection with my nieces and nephews or whatever, and I feel ashamed. I feel not just really sad, but I feel ashamed. And that is the situation that we're in now. We're in a situation where it's kind of, at least for a being as unenlightened as myself, it's not possible to engage in all this contemplation without finding oneself in places of sadness and shame and so forth, that of course one doesn't want to be in. So yeah, I just wanted to share that and to so therefore to sort of make clear that on the one hand we're trying to enter into this space of look at the amazing gifts that can come from acceptance and connection and gratitude and so forth. And on the other hand, not trying to pretend and therefore I'm in some sense kind of completely relaxed and equanimous and job done or something. It just isn't like that. It's both and, right?
Acceptance doesn't mean saying everything's okay.
No.
In the sense that acceptance is saying at one level, the universe is unfolding as it should, quote unquote, yet at the same time, we are each as human beings confronted with immense hurt and sorrow and damage and danger that we do. And we have to make decisions because we are embodied and human. We have to discern, where is my point of contact? Where is my source of act? What do I do? Where denial and retreat and avoidance is simply not an option.
Although it's also natural and attractive.
Yeah, very attractive.
Yeah.
So, but in this notion of acceptance carries with it this yes quality of, wow, yeah, this feels like shit. This feels really awful. This hurts. I mean, I sometimes have waves of anxiety, terror even, about my children, my grandchildren, what kind of life. Yeah, I'm a good deal older than you. The chances of me around to are non-existent. It's not going to happen. I shall have, I'm well on. I'll be well gone by the time 2057 comes around. But that doesn't bring me any comfort at all. I'm slightly pissed off that I won't see what the world is. But then I think from another dimension, I probably will. But leaving that to one side, it means that all this stuff that I feel, like the fear, the shame, the anger, the anxiety, the powerlessness, that's my grist to the mill. That's my work. Okay, how do I have this? Not hold it, because that means I'm kind of stuck with it. Okay, this is the material I've got. How do I use it to transform myself? How do I use it to transform my relationship to others and the world? And sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I mess up. And that's okay too.
And I couldn't agree more. And in the spiritual teaching that I seek to do, that a central point of the practices of acceptance, of non-dual acceptance, is that when we accept everything, included in what we accept are our own most treasured values, and included in what we accept are the emotions that we have for a reason. The anger that we have for a reason, because of our passion for justice and the love and the care that underlies it. The grief that we have for a reason, because if you don't grieve when something beautiful and precious is being destroyed, then there's something inhuman about you, right? These emotions themselves mean that our acceptance in an engaged spirituality is not at all a sort of cynical resignation or just let it go or something like that. On the contrary, right? And that again is how even these very, very difficult emotions that I was feeling and expressing a few minutes ago, as you say, they are grist to the mill, and they point us to some of the places where we need to be, right? Some of the time when we feel shame, what's going on is we are falling short of values or standards which we are determined to hold ourselves to, and that's a fine thing.
I think that one of the gifts that the spiritual life brings us is we're not alone. That the possibility of this I amness that is both personal is also transpersonal. That there is a power at work in the universe, a creativity, a love, whatever you want to call it, but there is that sense of not being alone. And that absence of aloneness is very powerful. It brings us a sense of belonging to the world and a participant in it and a willing participant. Now, there can be a sense then that unless you reach the spiritual or psychological heights of human perfection, then there's not much you can do otherwise. But I remember my teacher was saying to me long ago, he said, just because you're phony doesn't mean you help an awful lot of people. So I learned to accept there are many aspects of my personality that fall short, that I'm not, I don't reach, and I'm not at the ideal quality that I would like to see myself as being, but I can still do good in the world. I learned that as 40 years in nursing, but I could be one of the most messed up persons on the planet, but it didn't stop me putting that person down and being there for people who needed you and being engaged with them, in this case, in their healthcare, often to the point of death. So there is something there about the spiritual life that teaches us humility, that we do not have to be some idealized, enlightened being in order to participate in the healing and the wholeness of the world.
No,
It's in
and
all of us.
something that goes wrong with some new age spirituality, right, is some kind of fantasy of I have to perfect myself before I do anything to help other people or the world. And of course, because you'll never perfect yourself unless you're completely delusional, in which case you still actually haven't perfected yourself. That means that in practice, mostly they never get to help anybody else or the world. And this is actually a kind of an egotistical kind of substitute for spirituality. What you've just said also takes me to the question of time. So we spoke earlier about the important and rising sense in which deep ecological consciousness is coming to involve a recognition of, for example, crucially, the consciousness, the relatability to ourselves and vice versa of non-human animals. But in terms of not being alone, something which is also very important to me is thinking about persons who are dead and persons who are yet to be born. And I think that when we start to see ourselves and feel ourselves in contact with our ancestors who are dead, and in contact with our descendants of future generations who are not yet in existence, that makes us feel less alone, and it gives us a more profound sense of another kind of interconnection. And of course, especially in relation to the future generations, it gives us a greater sense of kind of, well, a certain weight of responsibility and a certain kind of potentiality for us to be in connection with beings who are hugely important, hugely neglected in our world, hugely neglected in our politics, absolutely exquisite in their fragility. I mean, what's more fragile than a newly born baby? Well, what's more fragile than a newly born baby is beings that are not even conceived yet. You know, that it's not even certain whether they're even going to get a chance to exist at all, or if they do, how poisoned or wrecked their world will be. So when we can expand to start to feel into our own ancestors and our own descendants, both within familiar lines, but also more broadly across society, across the world, etc., then that brings with it profound importances and profound possibilities.
I'd say two things about that. One is just to flip back quickly to the idea of who does the helping, who does all this work.
Yeah.
Is that particularly if you look at the Judeo-Christian tradition, the people who, the prophets, the people who did so initiate, even the great master contemplative, my greatest friend Jesus, they messed up.
Yeah.
You know, I have Jesus as someone who gets impatient with people, who the night before he dies is absolutely scared spitless. He's so frightened he sweats blood. So, you know, the essential humanness of those who are our teachers is really part of that. So that, and then beyond that, it's taking that, well, how do we participate with that in the world? Because we're not just dealing with the world now.
Yeah.
This connection is not just with the world as it is and how we'd like it to be. It goes deeper and longer in time, so that, for example, when politicians and others say, you know, we have to think about the world for our children or grandchildren, not everyone is going to have children or grandchildren. And this is where the connection is. This is more, no, this is the whole of life in the future of which we are a part. It's not just about us, our personal human story and how humans will experience the world. That is important. But it's about a profound sense of life continuing beyond us, of which we are a part. There's almost like, I hate to use the word, there's a moral imperative there. There's something in that arises when we feel that connection, that profound love that lies at the root of all things, then we cannot not act. Love isn't lazy. It makes us want to engage with the world in some way. And if we've done the work on ourselves and are more aware of ourselves and the world, then we can see the engagement is within defined limits. What is expected of us? We'll never be asked to do more than we're capable of doing. I believe that is a truism. So that, you know, it may be for some of us.
But you mean that because we're capable of doing much more than we often suppose?
And we have that sense of capability because we are grounded in, we're rooted into something that is other than just who we think we are. It empowers us, it gives us strength, something to draw on.
Yeah.
Whether it be for some people who say it's the love of God, or whether it's the Holy Spirit, or whether it's Allah, or whatever it might be, there is, and that's not some kind of, those who say that those things are just human fabrications. You know, billions of people down millions of years can't all be wrong, that there actually is something other in which we rest and out of which we are able to function in the world. Now, if it is a fantasy, all of that, then it's a damn good fantasy because it enables us to continue functioning in a world that can be so brutal sometimes.
Yeah. I want to just take up briefly what you said about love, which I thought was very beautiful. So as you emphasized, love is something that we do. If there's no doing of it, then it's not love. You know, an attitude that doesn't have any connection with any, it's like the battering husband who says to his wife, I love you, but never shows it. No, it's not love. Sorry. You're wrong, you're mistaken, you're lying, whatever. But love is also something that we are, right? And again, this is something I like to say to my students, that you can start to get a sense of when you really go deeply into the difficult emotions as well as the easy and attractive emotions, that everything is love. That there's a very real sense in which we come to understand the whole kind of movement of life, and not just our own life, the whole movement of life as a manifestation of love.
And if the spiritual life is anything, it's learning about love. And we all have, and it doesn't stop. There's no end to it. Until we turn up our toes, we're still learning about love. And I too have students and people who come for spiritual direction. And sometimes I'm not like you, Stephen. I mean, I don't have a spiritual life. I don't pray. I don't meditate. I don't do Tai Chi. My response is, you've got a job, you've got family, you've got kids, you've got neighbors, you've got pets. They're all teaching you about love all the time. Boy, have my children taught me about love, and I'm still learning, fierce lessons about love and community. And when push comes to shove, I'm down at the bottom of the garden with my bees, who decide that today they're fed up with me and are going to sting me. I'm learning some fierce lessons about love from, something that really wants to hurt you. And boy, can they hurt. But so the person who called in and the delivery person who popped in today, the things I do with our planting the garden, the people I hang out with, our walk is, there's a lesson for love in all of it, and how we as humans are aware, how we live in loving awareness. That's the trick, living in loving awareness all the time. And sometimes we fall into forgetting, and then we remember, and then we forget, then we remember. But maybe that we reach a point where there's more remembering than there is forgetting, if we're lucky and we do the work. Or we've eaten enough chocolate biscuits. I don't know what the full solution is, but we each have our way into that. Living love as an action, not just
being love, becoming love. Well, for the first time, I feel like I don't really have anything to add to that. So I wonder if our lovely conversation is coming towards a natural end at this point. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I find so much of our culture rooted in that Cartesian model. I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
And what we've been saying is that's not true.
No.
I am, therefore I think. I am, therefore I love. I am, therefore I serve. And I think that's the rootedness for us. And if there's an I am, a personal I am, a transpersonal I am, then for me which is human and other than human.
Yes. I would also add, I am because we are, and the we here is not just a human we either. Right? This is the kind of spirit that you get from some African philosophy and from mysticism and religion from the Indian subcontinent a lot more, which doesn't always come so natural for us here in the West. But I think we're starting to tune into it a little bit late, but perhaps not too late for everything.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And there's hope in that.
Yes.
There's hope.
Yes.
Not a false, not a hopium that'll make it
No.
all better, not an opium to make us feel better, but a hope that says that somehow life goes on, life finds a way, love finds a way.
Mm.
What forms there will be in the future, you know, right? Trust. There's a trust somehow.
Back to Julian of Norwich.
Mhm.
I live in rural Norfolk and get to visit this beautiful Lake District, as I say, a couple of times a year. And when I came here on the train, which is what I do, I had the great good fortune on my walk from the bus station to the train station in Norwich to pass the church, which is dedicated to Julian. So I get a reminder of her, like, about a couple of times a week usually, and of her extraordinary famous words, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well.
Yeah, well, she like all mystics across traditions hit that spot.
Yeah.
That and it's not a Pollyanna-ish,
No.
everything's going to be all right. It's a deep sense of truth that there is a flow, a creative flow to the whole of life that's rooted in something that is ourselves and other than ourselves, that enables that similar, it will be okay. Whether it's okay in another dimension, another reality, or this one or another. And I believe it's in this one. I think there is that possibility of hope in us all. And
provided that it's active hope.
Yeah.
And if anyone hasn't read Julian of Norwich, the thing which is incredibly striking about her writing is it's kind of shot through with this immense suffering, which she went through, which she saw around her as well, but especially that she went through. So there's this immense suffering, and then there's this spirit of a sense in which life goes on, love goes on, this flow is somehow always there.
It's what she was called to, that we're all called to, that in immense suffering, we still love.
Yeah.
We don't give up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just don't give up.
Yeah. That seems a suitable note on which to end. You heard it here first. Don't give up.
Oh.